Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Ghosts and Spirits video. I thought I would mix this one in here while I'm continuing to do your mysteries and disappearances suggestions. This one has to do with a fascinating story, something that I actually found on a website that was talking about the 25 creepiest curses out there in this world. But when I was reading this information, I realized it fit more on the ghost and spirit side, mainly because it has to do with an apparent haunted wedding dress that belonged to a young woman, and then some of the other hauntings associated with the house that this young woman lived at, and then the family members lived at as well. I'm going to present a lot of that info here and then also share apparently some discrepancies associated with the legends tied to these hauntings, and then also some of the reasons as to why associated with it. But it has to do with this. You're looking at a picture of it now. It's known as Anna Baker and her haunted wedding dress. That was immediately like in the title that caught my attention, which is why I wanted to share it here. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this stuff here, and then I'll give my thoughts and opinions on it. I'd love to hear what your thoughts as well, especially if you've had the fortune of going to this haunted mansion. So here's essentially what happened. You have to go way, way back, at least into the time period associated with the 1840s, and then that's when there was a gentleman, a wealthy iron master by the name of Elias Baker. He was someone who had apparently created his own little dynasty at the time. He had a family as well. It consisted of his wife, a woman by the name of Haiti, and then he had two sons, a gentleman by the name of David, another one by Sylvester, and then finally, a daughter by the name of Anna, who was born in 1836. So just a little bit of time before the actual home was built, the actual haunted home. In other words, this was because Elias Baker, again in the mid-40s, commissioned someone, a prominent man, to also create a mansion, architect by the name of Robert Carey Long Jr. And when he did so, it took a couple of years, but it was done. And as you can see here, it's a stately mansion. Like, this is huge. This is something that today would be tens of millions of dollars. Who knows what it cost back then, but he definitely had the time and the money to create this 28-room, 3-story mansion. So absolutely, this guy, Elias Baker, was utilizing his wealth to showcase it at the same time. But as it turns out, sometime later on, that's when things started to take a little bit of a tragic learning. For starters, cut to a couple of years later, and by that time, David Baker, who was 28 years old then, married someone and then moved out of the home. Unfortunately, though, he ended up being killed in a steamboat accident there in New York. The story goes that he was brought back to that mansion. His body may have actually started the hauntings there because, as it turns out, it was too cold in that time in September to bury him. In other words, the ground was way too hard for it. So they had to store the son's body there in the basement at least until spring, and stories go that his hauntings are tied to that. More on that here in just a moment. But the main hauntings are associated with Anna Baker. This is the legend, at least, that's tied to those hauntings. It's almost like a tragic love story of sorts. It turns out that once she was 18, she ended up falling in love with one of the steel workers that Elias, the father, again had for his company. This was apparently prohibited, not just because he was an employee, but also it seemed like the idea was that they wanted her to move along the lines of marrying someone prominent, somebody with money, somebody with name recognition, that kind of stuff. But either way, though, she kept that secret from her family, her and the other guy, essentially the secret that they had as far as being lovers. And when that happened, eventually the secret was discovered. It was to a point, though, where they were eventually proposing to each other. She accepted it from her boyfriend, at that time now fiance. She even picked out a beautiful wedding dress, the wedding dress that's in question associated with this video. And they had many, many plans to get married. But again, the plan was leaked. When that happened, that's when Elias found out, and then he banished that employee, fired him outright, and then stated that if he ever returned back to that mansion, then he would threaten him with death. This, of course, just created a huge tragic circumstance for Anna. She was deeply in love with him. What made it even worse was that Elias was forbidding her from being able to go out to even see this man. It seemed like he was almost putting her into a lockdown situation there in that mansion. He even found some of the letters that they had used and then sent each other, and he threw them into a fire at that time. And she, of course, became even more actually depressed from it. So she stayed in that room for a long, long time. The story goes that for years on end, she refused to go out. She refused to eat. She refused to speak with anyone. Just long bouts of depression. Cut to a couple of years later, and finally in 1864, Big Bad Elias, the father, in other words, passed away. And poor Anna finally saw this as an opportunity to find that man, to be able to see him once again, and then finally reclaim her love. But as it turns out, that fiance, he found someone else at the time. She found another love. He married her. He settled with her, and they had a family. And once she found out, then poor Anna became even far more depressed. Once again, she went back into her room, and then this time, the only time anyone ever saw her was through basically the window. She was there on the third floor, her room was, and that's the only time anyone would see her, just these very, very brief glimpses. But what people could see was this. She had on that wedding dress, the ill-fated wedding dress. She had it on, and she was just dancing alone right there in that room, who knows how many times. And then on top of that, people that would walk by the room, again, with the door being closed, they would hear her heartbroken sobs. Only finally later in 1914 did Anna Baker pass away, but the idea was that she passed away just completely alone, completely depressed, her heart just completely shattered. And so because of that, her ghost now apparently claims that mansion. That dress actually used to be there only up until a few years ago. The story goes that it was there, but up until the point where the dress started deteriorating because of, I guess, the sunlight or because of the conditions there in that museum. But when you were there and you saw that dress, you could apparently see some of the hauntings associated with it. It's been said that the dress would almost shake on its own. It was almost like somebody was trying to wear it. It would dance, in other words, at other times whenever it was as if it was in its own wedding. People would also see the dress just slightly move here or there. They've even seen glimpses with the dress out of the case. It was in a glass case, but it was floating around, but it must have been something where it was a blink and you miss it type moment. And then in other situations, other hauntings associated with the dress are you could hear some of the wedding music. You could also hear some of the sobs associated with Anna. This goes back, though, to her basically being in the room for all those years. So if you're in that room, Anna's room, in other words, that's where apparently you can hear more of those sobs there. And then also hear the movement associated as if somebody is dancing around. But for many years, visitors saw that, at least until the dress was finally removed. And then as far as some of the other hauntings associated with that place, I was mentioning earlier about the son. Apparently that son, whose body was stored in the basement for those months while the ground outside was being thawed out, apparently people hear his screams coming from the basement, which was at that time made into a makeshift ice room. And then when people go downstairs to see what's going on, nobody is there. Obviously, it's empty. And then also, as far as the father, Elias, people have also heard him and seen him within the mansion as well. Apparently, he's seen usually dressed in black. He's walking around his office. People can also hear him as well walking about. The wife as well, Elias Baker, people have seen her too, and she's apparently walking around also in black. Even then, there was another son, Sylvester, who ended up passing away in one of the rooms, one of the sitting rooms as well. His ghost apparently goes there too. People can know that it's him because he was walking around with a cane before he ended up passing away. So they could hear the tap tap associated with his cane, knowing that he's in that location. So those are all of the legends associated with the hauntings of that Baker mansion. Now let's see what the actual reality is as far as some of those situations. The story goes that in reality, Anna had a happy life. She didn't necessarily have a forbidden love per se. One more on that here in a minute. Like, she didn't have somebody that was an employee of the business and then it was found out and she was just absolutely forbidden and she locked herself in her room because of it. No, it turns out, and this is from actual letters that she wrote, she had a pretty good relationship with her parents. In fact, she was there with her mother for the longest time, taking care of her before her mother got sick and then eventually passed away. And so she was there in that house. She wasn't a recluse. She was walking about. The closest, though, associated with a heartbreak for her and a kind of forbidden love has to do with this. One of Anna's best friends was a girl by the name of Annie Porter. She kept some letters and some diaries on her end. It was through that information that it was discovered that Anna fell in love with her cousin, a guy by the name of William Lawrence. And he too ended up passing away afterward from some unspecified illness. And so because of that, she was a little bit heartbroken from it. But it was nothing to the point, again, involving her locking herself away and never being seen again type stuff. But that's the closest that's linked to it. There's even this, that the dress itself that people commonly tie to Anna is actually just an anonymous dress. Like, it was a wedding dress of somebody unknown that is just there. And then through decades, some of that information started to develop stories. People started seeing it move, which, by the way, is another thing. Apparently, it's because there were floorboards underneath the mansion that were loose. And so when people were walking about that room, it would accidentally move the actual dress, the display case for it. And so because of that, that's where ghost stories started to come about. And then that's where people started realizing, wow, this is something happening. Is it tied to someone that lived here? And then people started linking it to Anna and so on. So you can go both ways. There's the idea that there's those legends tied to Anna Baker, the haunted dress, and all the other hauntings with the Baker mansion. And then there's at least some of the real info that's been passed down, but it could be more in the gray area, maybe a mixture of both. I would love to check out that mansion, that haunted Baker mansion, and see if that's something real. You can visit it apparently to this day, walk about and so on. So if somebody has a chance to go visit that place, it's a historical museum too. That means it's going to be there forever, pretty much. You'll be able to then check it out and then see if there's anything associated with any hauntings. But that's pretty much it as far as the info linked to Anna Baker and her haunted wedding dress. Makes me want to go check it out sometime if I'm ever having a chance to go do so. But if anybody else has it there, has a chance to go visit it in person, by all means, please do so. It'd be great to hear what your local comments are as well. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.